Welcome to a bonus episode of the MMA Lock-Cast. We are going to be covering LFA 195 this weekend, which goes down in Vail, Colorado, and it is headlined by a former Tough alum in Bekzad Usmonov as he takes on Justin Wetzell, who's looking to rebound from the hiccup that he had just a few fights ago and get back on the radar of the UFC, which I'm sure will be having a keen eye on this fight, considering the fight of the season performance that Usmonov put on last time around, even though he came up on the short end against Ziehfreund. I'm sure the UFC is still circling Usmonov, but Wetzell could definitely take the hype off of him if he's able to get the win here. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, and your boy on social media at MMA LOTN, but also the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, ensuring you leave no stone unturned when you're researching these upcoming MMA events. And that's exactly how I know so much about these fighters that I'm about to quickly break down for you guys and give you guys picks for. But I also know a ton about many different promotions. On this archive, though, we cover 17 different promotions from all over the world. We're just about to surpass 4,500 fighter profiles for you to go through and browse through, so you can do your own researching. And we just surpassed 100 subscribers on this service as well. So shout out to everybody that's been supporting the service and realizing how useful it is, especially if you like to do your own researching, predicting, and breaking down fights. This is your one-stop shop to ensure that you get as many direct links to past fights for all these competitors. Make sure you guys check it out. The MMA Fight Archive, link in the description below. All right, LFA 195 going down this weekend, like I talked about at the top of the show. Actually, it's supposed to go down tonight, so I do apologize in terms of getting this out on fight day rather than the previous day when I was hoping to get it out, but this birthday celebration went on a little bit longer than I was expecting it to. I'm going to soak it all in. So I hope you guys can bear with me there, but still plenty of time before the fight card kicks off later tonight for you guys to digest this information and take what you would like from it and try to make your own plays from it. Otherwise, you guys can check out the MMA LOT and Patreon page, link for that in the description below, where I have track plays for all of these, or not all of the fights, but for the fights that I actually want to shoot on. If you don't want to hop on the Patreon page, maybe you guys can decipher from where my head is at for a lot of these fights and see where I actually ended up pulling the trigger. All right, like I said, I'm going to be very brief about these, so I'm going to go over these very quickly. I got 4 videos that I got to drop today. This one, I got quick picks for the UFC 308 card. I got my free parlay video that I'm going to be dropping, and then the 3 best prop bets as well. So a ton of content dropping on the YouTube page today, not to mention all the other content I've already dropped for UFC 308. So if you're watching this midday Friday or even Friday evening, make sure you guys check out the YouTube page and see all the other great content that I've dropped, mainly betting tips, perspectives, and all that stuff for LFA and the UFC. Appreciate the love, appreciate the support. Make sure you guys hit that subscribe as well. All right, let's get right into it. First fight of the night, Jared Ferrera coming in at plus 550, going up against Alex Fisher. Squash match here. Ferrera completely out of shape, seems to come from a grappling background, but Fisher much better, much slicker on the feet, should get the finish here. I don't really like playing minus 800 on a guy that only has about a minute and a half of professional MMA experience, but Fisher should get the job done here without too much issue. Next up, Daniel Rojas coming in at plus 425, going up against Bobby Ziehfreund, coming in at minus 600. Rojas fell short in his pro debut back in November 2021. He's taken off a bunch of time, came back in mid-2023 to start training, has a Taekwondo striking style, trains out of Gilbert Smith's gym in Colorado. We just saw his son Elijah Smith get signed to the UFC through the Contender Series several weeks back. Has some decent wrestling as well, but also can be grinded out and put on his back and kept there. Ziehfreund, training out of Factory X, made his successful pro debut back in March by picking up a decision victory and utilizing a lot of wrestling and grappling, and I'm expecting him to do that here once again against Rojas, looking to put Rojas on his back. The only reason I'm not overly confident on the minus 600 here is you don't know what kind of improvements and change of style or even change of confidence that we'll see from Rojas coming into this matchup, so I would rather pass than playing the chalk or even just investing on the guy that's been out of the cage for as long as he has. Next up, Kanon Davis coming in at minus 140, going up against Isaiah Torres, coming in at plus 120. A fun fight here between two lanky strikers. Davis has a knockout from range. I believe it was his pro debut, but he did end up picking up a rib injury loss last time around against one of the more underrated prospects on the LFA roster, and Chance Ikai. Decent striker, very active off his back if he gets put there, but he's going to be fighting a willing competitor in terms of the striking realm with Isaiah Torres. I initially came across him back in February of 2023 when I was researching him for his Fury FC fight, which ended up going to a split draw. He's 3-1 since that fight. Does a great job in terms of utilizing his length. He loves a calf kick from distance as well, and he throws in great combinations. It's unfortunate that all of his wins have come against guys with 500 or less records. 5 of his wins, obviously. The guys that he's coming up short against, not bad opposition. But considering how this fight should play out, I do think that we'll see Torres have a little bit more success, hence why I don't mind him as an underdog in the spot. I think he'll be the better, more effective striker, I should say. And I really expect him to batter that lead leg of Davis, which will eventually lead to Torres being able to cruise later on in this fight, as Davis gets a little bit gun-shy and very difficult to find his movement and his range and his speed because of the damage that he's going to be taking to that lead leg. So give me Torres by decision, and a decent underdog within the first 3 fights there. Next up, squash match, as we got Reyes Talundzic coming in at minus 1,400, going up against Ovidio Bojorquez, coming in at plus 800. Bojorquez, slugger, has some decent power in his shots, but it's obvious that he gets grinded out in most of his fights, and that's the MO for Reyes Talundzic here. Minus 1,400, prohibitive favorite. Can't parlay that, but I do think that he goes out there and squashes Bojorquez here. Considering the under 2.5 at minus 150, not a bad spot to take a shot there. But I do think that this is a bounce back spot for Talundzic, who got knocked out by Daniel Frunza in his last matchup. Talundzic seems like one of those guys that's hyped on the regional scene, but may not be able to crack it into the UFC. But he should be able to go out there and squash guys of the level of his opponent this weekend. So give me Talundzic, but the under 2.5, probably the best spot to play. Next up, Ashley Deen coming in at plus 425, going up against Melissa Croden, who comes in at minus 600. Deen started her career 3-5, but is now 5-1 over her last 6 fights. But it's obvious that the level of competition she's beating are fighters that usually don't put up too much resistance. The combined record of those 5 opponents that she's beaten in her last 6 fights was 14-19, with none of them having with all of them having a 500 and losing record as well. It seems to have some decent striking, but her takedown defense is not that good. She's pretty basic off of her back, and she's also 35 years old. Melissa Croden may not make it to the UFC, considering that she's 32 years old, and she did end up coming up short in a LFA title fight back against Jacqueline Cavalcante in April of 2023. She got outstruck by the better technical striker that night, but she did manage to bounce back with a dominant victory over Katharina Laner earlier this year, taking her opponent to the ground and just smashing her from that top position, getting that stoppage in the 3rd round. Croden is normally a fighter that likes to use a karate style where she darts in and out of range with her straight shots down the pipe, but seeing her take to the grappling game like she did last time around gives some confidence, especially coming into this fight where she should have no problem taking Deen to the ground and being the more physical and stronger woman. Look for Croden to dominate Deen on the mat here and stick with her finishing ways, as all 5 of Croden's wins have come inside the distance, so I don't mind taking a little bit of chalk on that under 2.5 here, as I think there's a big enough skill discrepancy and physicality discrepancy from the Croden side, and I think that she goes out there and smashes Deen and picks up the win within 2 rounds. Next up, Kendra McIntyre coming in at minus 240, going up against Marina Monteiro, who comes in at plus 205. McIntyre is coming off of a knockout of the year candidate last time around, as she knocked out her opponent with a beautiful head kick. That was a fight where she was facing a zombie who just continuously came forward did not give McIntyre much room to breathe, but McIntyre did a great job in terms of utilizing her striking background, making her opponent pay whenever she crashed the pocket recklessly, and that ultimately led to that nasty head kick in the third round of their fight. McIntyre, obviously, like I said, coming from a striking background, is working on her grappling realm as well, but you still have to be concerned considering that her lone loss came by DQ when she was in a very tight armbar against her opponent, and she just repeatedly pretty much kicked the head of her opponent over and over again, which led to that DQ, which possibly shows how close that submission was in terms of being locked up as well. And again, the level of jiu-jitsu player that her opponent was going into that fight, not that high level. So that is where the concern comes. McIntyre normally does a good job in terms of keeping fights upright, but when they are on the mat, if she is facing somebody that is enough of a threat with a BJJ, that is some cause for concern. On the feet, she looks great. But I do think the reason she's a big favorite in this matchup is because of that highlight reel knockout, and she is more known amongst the fans that watch LFA, whereas Monteiro, coming in into her LFA debut here, undefeated, 3-0, 4-0, BJJ purple belt, but she has been mixing it up on the training match with a lot of notable fighters. Poliana Viena, Larissa Pacheco, Jessica Andrade. She spent time at the UFC PI with some of those fighters as well. She seems strong. She seems physical. She seems fine with throwing down in the pocket, even though McIntyre might have the striking advantage there. Monteiro could do a good enough job in terms of engaging in some pocket exchanges that McIntyre may not be prepared for in terms of eating the type of damage that she could eat there. But to me, it could be the takedowns of Monteiro that will change the tide of this fight and make it a lot closer than the odds actually indicate. So I would bet Monteiro in this spot as the big underdog just to take advantage of the odds, but my official prediction will actually end up being on the Kendra McIntyre side. We've seen good enough takedown defense from her in the past, notably against Elandria Rosales, who I don't rate that highly, but she is physical. She does often look to get takedowns, and McIntyre did a good job in terms of shutting that down. The advantage that Monteiro will have here over what Elandria had going into the McIntyre fight would be that Marina will likely throw strikes on the feet rather than just going for desperation takedowns and trying to engage in the grappling in that way. So there are more paths to victory for Monteiro than what Elandria had, and more paths for her to get this fight to the ground. But seeing the defensive grappling that we've seen from McIntyre, especially with the defensive takedowns, and knowing that she'll have a pretty solid striking advantage here, she should be able to touch up Monteiro, maybe get a later finish as Monteiro gets a little bit too confident in the pocket, leaving herself exposed to getting knocked out. But Monteiro is definitely worth the stab at anything better than plus 200 here. So McIntyre prediction, under 2.5, plus money, not a bad spot. But Monteiro is worth a consideration. Next up, Micah Haas coming in at minus 200, going up against Eric Calvert, who comes in at plus 170. Now, for the Haas side of things, he has a clean 5-0 record, and the majority of his wins come from him taking his opponents to the ground and grinding them out from that top position. Striking look doesn't look that bad either, but it obviously helps him blend his takedowns behind it because he does such a good job in terms of getting his opponents to the ground and then maintaining that top position where not many opponents have been able to work back to their feet. His opponent, Eric Calvert, is actually the number one ranked flyweight out of 6 flyweights in Arkansas, and he is the number 3 pound for pound fighter out of Arkansas. I think there's only 160, I think maybe even 300, one of those numbers. But again, this is Tapology based, and it obviously considers that he's 5-0 and has been very active as of late. All of his 4 of his wins have come by submission, and the funny part about it is it seems like his opponents have no idea how to utilize submission defense. I believe all of Calvert's wins have come with him being on his back and throwing up triangles and submissions, and there's been so many times where he's failed an attempt with the triangle, and there's an opportunity for his opponents to get out of that dangerous position, but they just put themselves right back in it, and Calvert is able to capitalize and end up getting the tap that way. He is active off his back, so we'll give him that. The fact that he continuously attacks these submissions from that position, but you have to take into consideration the clumsiness of the fighters that he's been going up against, whereas other fighters like Haas, in my opinion, who should do a good enough job in terms of keeping him on his back, staying out of those submission attempts, and then making Calvert pay for his overconfidence off of his back, which will allow Haas to just maintain that top position and just chip away at it and win in that form. I'm not overly confident in this spot. Maybe Calvert is better than I'm expecting him to be, but Haas should do a good enough job in terms of keeping this fight on the mat, keeping that dominant position, grinding it out, and winning it on the scorecards. Next up, Reyes coming in at plus 255, going up against Kevin Fernandez, who comes in at minus 305. Reyes, it's been over a year since we've seen him in action, but last time around he took the O of the undefeated Jordan Burkholder, who's a very strong wrestler, and he did get a lot of takedowns, but he was unable to get off on enough damage for the judges to actually score that fight in his favor. Reyes did a great job in terms of staying active with his long range, straight shots down the pipe, BJJ brown belt, so he was threatening with some submissions off of his back, and at least keeping Burkholder occupied from that top position where he was able to get damage off of his back and while defending some of those takedown attempts. He is 36 years old now, so he's probably counted out for anybody that could potentially make it to the UFC, but he will still always be a very tough test for a lot of guys on the regional scene, especially if the LFA continues to bring him back and test these guys that are trying to get to the UFC and get to the next level. That's exactly what he's going to try to do here against Kevin Fernandez, who's a very exciting prospect with a very nasty submission game as well. 5 of his 7 wins have come by submission, and 4 of them by submission. He used to train alongside Kevin Holland. I believe Terrence McKinney is now one of his training partners, but he seems to come from a striking background, but has developed such a dangerous grappling game that it's a treat to see him implement that style and submit his opponents and finish them from the ground position. He is so slick with engaging in the clinch, even if it's his opponent shooting for a takedown or engaging in the clinch, and just wrapping himself around his opponent, getting to the back, and then getting them to the ground, and then eventually finding that back position, whether that leads to him getting a rear naked choke or forcing his opponent to turn into him and get that half guard, that side control where he can get an arm triangle choke. He's very good in terms of maintaining those positions and then threatening with submission opportunities or even finishing opportunities as well. I think Fernandez is the next guy from the LFA to make it to the UFC. Obviously, there's a ton of guys from the LFA that will make it to the UFC, but he is one guy that I have circled that should make it to the UFC within the next year, maybe even be on next year's Contender Series if he ends up racking up another win or two. Very high-level fighter. I think he was minus 200 yesterday, ballooned up to minus 300 today for good reason as well. I think Fernandez dominates this matchup. I think he nullifies the BJJ brown belt of Reyes. I think he threatens Reyes on the feet, especially with his pace and pressure, gets this fight to the ground. Maybe doesn't get a finish per se, but I do think he dominates this matchup pretty well dominates Reyes, wins this fight. Fernandez wins this fight by dominating Reyes is what I mean. I felt like I said Dominic Reyes for a second there. Anyway, next up, co-main event, Schiro coming in at plus 110, going up against AJ Fletcher coming in at minus 130. Former Bellator prospect going up against former UFC prospect. We'll start off on the Schiro side, who had his first post-Bellator matchup last time around under the LFA lights, and he took on a Fury FC veteran, and he won by split decision that night, but I gotta say I wasn't the most impressed with his performance. He was my lock of the night play for that LFA card, and I was glad to be able to cash the ticket, but that was not a lock of the night type performance. I thought he looked a little bit sloppy. He did do a good enough job in terms of getting out of some bad positions when he was put there, but what had made me so impressed with him going into that matchup was seeing his takedown defense and defensive work against such a strong wrestler like Logan Storley. I believe that was his Bellator debut. He was able to get off some damage on the feet in the striking realm and even went to a split decision and had a decent case to actually end up winning that fight, but ended up coming out on the losing end, went 1-3 for Bellator, but even in those 3 losses looked like a very solid prospect, a guy that put on a lot of resistance and a lot of showed good effort. But again, the Austin Jones fight, I thought he should have looked better, but I'm glad to have still cashed that ticket. Good defensive wrestling normally, good pressure with his striking, trains out of pound for pound Muay Thai and I believe Team Elevation in Colorado, so this will be a home game for him. He's not a bad fighter. He's 30 years old, maybe we see a better version of him last time around, and not to mention he'll have that extra motivation knowing that the UFC is probably watching this matchup, considering that AJ Fletcher is a former UFC fighter as well. So that might give Schiro that confidence to be like, hey, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to show out and try to beat this former UFC guy and showcase that I deserve to be on that platform. Now, talking about Fletcher, he was 9-0 when he came into the UFC, won on the Contender Series, got the call up there, but I don't think he was completely ready to fight the UFC level competition, which is why he ended up going, 1-3 in the UFC, lost his last fight to Brian Battle, who has been looking tremendous as of late, so not a bad loss on his record, but a lot of his game was predicated on him getting early finishes. Otherwise, he starts to slow down and his opponents are able to either finish him or take over in the second and third rounds. Throws a lot of heat in his strikes to set up that takedown so he can start grinding his opponents out from that top position, opening up submission and finishing opportunities. But if he's unable to get that finish, things start to go south for him real quick. Now, I know he has a loss post UFC against a guy that was 4-3, but looking into that guy's record and researching him like I did going into his second last fight, that guy's not that bad. He's actually a decent fighter, but has fought some tough competition on the regional scene, which has led to that salty 4-3 record. So don't just automatically count out Fletcher because he has that loss to a 4-3 opponent. Look at that guy, look at his style, and look at the guys that he's come up short against. One of those losses came to Jacoby Smith, who just got signed to the from the Contender Series, and a guy that Dana White is all over, saying that he looks like he could be the real deal. In this matchup, though, I do think Fletcher will have some early success, but I think if Schiro comes in motivated, if he comes in confident, if he comes in showcasing the defensive wrestling that we saw from him when he fought a guy like Logan Storley, he should be able to stop most of Fletcher's advances on the mat and then really start to put it on him with the pressure and the pace. Home game for him, fighting in Colorado, he should have the advantage with the cardio and dealing with the altitude, and that should allow him to really start running away with this fight late, maybe producing a late finish or winning this fight on the scorecards. But I do think that Schiro is a solid underdog, plus 160 just yesterday or probably the day before. Now finds himself at plus 110. Seems like the public is on that side as well. So give me Schiro by decision. All right, main event time here. We got Justin Wetzell coming in at minus 200 going up against Bekzad Usmonov, who comes in at plus 170. Now, we'll start off on the Justin Wetzell side of things, who came up short in his last LFA fight where he got knocked out by Militia Rafael Dos Nascimento in the second round of their matchup. I think Wetzell had some solid success in that first round, ended up getting finished in the second round, and then bounced back on for the UFL, I believe it is. Back-to-back finishes, showcasing his dominant grappling skills where he's able to take opponents to the ground and just cut them up with nasty elbows, nasty ground and pound, looking for submission opportunities and looking to get his opponents out of there. His cardio looks great. His pace looks great. His relentlessness, very solid fighter all around. He lost his second professional fight, went on a 6-fight winning streak, then came up short to Do Nascimento, and then obviously now on this 2-fight winning streak again, and positioning himself to actually get back to a main event slot for the LFA. His opponent, Bekzad Usmonov, coming off the Ultimate Fighter where he competed at 145 pounds. He's actually a 135-pounder, which is where he's fighting in this matchup. But he put on a tremendous performance against Zigomatis Romaska, hurting Romaska a couple of times, but ultimately it was Romaska having the majority of success, allowing Romaska to end up winning that fight and advancing to the next round of the Ultimate Fighter. But it was clear that Dana was very impressed with Usmonov, which makes me believe, like I said at the top of the show, that the UFC and matchmakers are likely watching Usmonov closely here to see if he can actually get a win or two on the regional scene, and they could bring him in for a short notice spot or potentially on the Contender Series next year. But Wetzell could get that rub off of him by getting a pretty big win of his own by hopefully going out there and dominating Usmonov. Usmonov comes from a striking background. He has been taken down. He has been grinding out from some certain opponents, but he has also shown some good defensive grappling to get out of those bad positions and get back to his feet. Unfortunately for him, he's fighting a very tough Justin Wetzell here, whose pace, relentlessness, and cardio should be more than enough for him to keep Usmonov in those bad spots, continue to mat return him, continue to keep him on his back, and really damage him from that top position. Usmonov will be very tough to put away, hence why I think this fight ends up going over 2.5 rounds. But I do think Wetzell has most of the advantages here, and as long as his durability and chin holds up, he shouldn't have too much trouble having a disadvantage in the striking realm. look for this fight to mainly take place in this grappling realm. That's where we'll see Wetzell get the better of Usmonov and win this fight on the scorecards. There you guys go. LFA 195 broken down for you guys for the bonus episode of the MMA Lock-Cast. Again, I only do one of these a month, covering one of the regional shows that I cover on the Lock of the Night Patreon page, where I do written breakdowns for all these cards. But next month for November, ACA, Cage Warriors, Octagon, LFA, KSW. Those are the cards that are going down in November. So I'll break down one of those cards for you guys on the YouTube page. But otherwise, if you want access to all of them in written form, check out the MMA LOTM Patreon page, link in the description below. All right, that's a wrap. Check out the rest of the content that I got on the page. And again, quick picks version of the 308 breakdown dropping shortly. And then we also have the Locky Trinity, Locky two-step free parlay, and 3 best prop bets dropping later this evening. See you guys then. Peace.
Last thing.